Are the Baltimore Ravens showing trust in Rashod Bateman with the names they're bringing in for wide receiver visits? We talk about that and so much more coming up next here on this bonus episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, coming to you from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for tuning into this bonus episode of Locked On Ravens here on Saturday. We are free and available on all podcasting platforms, so that includes in video form on YouTube, where you can like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also in audio form, you can follow along wherever you get your podcast, subscribe, so Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the whole 9 yards there. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Little bonus episode action here today on Saturday. We had a lot of headlines for the Ravens, some news. Now, not the biggest signings, not Derrick Henry level signings. We did get some visit notes and some other stuff that went on. So I wanted to just wrap everything up. I don't want to try to pack too much into one show. So if we do bonus episodes, it works out because it gives us another episode to dive into other topics that we might not be able to hit on as much in another show because there's just so much other stuff to talk about. So this episode, we talked about it yesterday with Rocco DeSangro of Fox 45, but I wanted to do a deeper dive into this specific part of the conversation. With the wide receivers, I really feel like Baltimore is showing trust in Rashod Bateman based off of the names they've brought in for visits, Michael Gallup and Josh Reynolds being the two right now. So I want to just dive into that a little bit further, talk about Bateman, talk about why I think that way, and what the Ravens need to see, what we need to see from Rashod Bateman in 2024. We'll also get a little bit more into both Michael Gallup and Josh Reynolds, talk about their potential fits, what they bring, the risks of bringing both in, and where they can contribute if one of them or both. I wouldn't expect both, but if it happens, it happens. We'll talk about just where those guys would fit in with the team. Then we'll talk a bit about the direction of the Ravens right now, where they're going, what their roster looks like at the very moment, right as we record here on Saturday, and what it could look like as we get into a little bit more of free agency. And obviously the draft is almost a month away now, which is really, really crazy to think about. It's sneaking up on us. So we have a lot to dive into. Of course, the Ravens haven't made a move since the Derrick Henry signing of that magnitude. Obviously, we've seen the little signings here and there. They brought back Chris Board and brought in some depth corner-wise, offensive line-wise. But the bigger news has been the wide receiver visits, and that being Michael Gallup on Thursday and Josh Reynolds on Friday. Now, Baltimore hasn't made a move there. Of course, they'll probably make a move. I have a busy day today on Saturday planned, and I bet it's just how it works. They're going to make a move, and I'll find a way to go live. We will. If the Ravens make a move today, I will go live after it happens. So be sure to turn notifications on for that. But to me, I think that these moves, I guess they're not moves because they're only visits, but these visits, they show me that for right now, if you just look at those two names, the Ravens are showing trust in Rashod Bateman. Now, we know as the roster stands right now, Zay Flowers is the Ravens wide receiver one. It's not really a question after how he performed during his rookie season. But then there are some question marks behind him about, well, what are the Ravens going to do in the offseason? How are they going to address the position? As you look at their roster right now and what happens after this upcoming season, after 2024, the only wide receiver currently on the roster is Zay Flowers. That's it. Everybody else is on a one-year contract. Nelson Aguilar, one-year contract. Rashod Bateman, that fifth-year option, will it be accepted? Will it be declined? We'll get into that conversation a little bit further on in the show today. But the Ravens have to approach this. Eric DeCosta has to approach this both as a present and a future type deal. And I think for Baltimore, they are going to, if these visits are true, if the Ravens truly go with a Michael Gallup or Josh Reynolds, that type of receiver, that's a player who complements Rashod Bateman, not takes away from his role. I think that would solidify Bateman as the number 2 option with the Ravens. Now, we can have the debate of should they do that? Should they bring in a Josh Reynolds or Michael Gallup and make that their veteran signing? Because, again, if you're an everydayer, you've heard this from me a lot, but I think the Ravens are on board now with drafting a guy and signing a guy. So if your veteran is Josh Reynolds, that to me is not your number 2 wide receiver. That's your number 3 wide receiver. If you're Michael Gallup, you could argue he's either your number 3 or number 4 behind Nelson Aguilar, depending on who you like better. Bateman is somebody where if they were to bring in a Cortland Sutton, or if they were to sign Marquise Brown back, or they were to give a contract to Calvin Ridley, that would be a guy who would come in and take away from Bateman's role as the potential number 2. That guy would slot in as the number 2 wide receiver behind Zay Flowers at this point. But that's not the type of guy that Josh Reynolds is at this point in his career. It's not the type of player that Michael Gallup is at this point in his career. If the Ravens sign one of those guys or another player along those lines, I think Michael Thomas would fall into that category somewhat. But some of the lesser guys, I think there was a list that was put out a couple days ago. I'm going to try to find it really quickly. But of the wide receivers who were still left in free agency, and look, it's not necessarily slim pickings, but it's not thick pickings either. I mean, there aren't a lot of really quality like options that you could immediately slot in and say, oh yeah, this guy's going to challenge Rashod Bateman. I think the only guy left is probably Tyler Boyd on this list. Other guys include Hunter Renfrow, Allen Robinson, Odell Beckham Jr., Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Russell Gage, DJ Chark, Jamal Agnew, Deontay Hardy, Paris Campbell, Mecole Hardman. Those guys don't move a needle. And I think to me, at this point, the Ravens are just going to go, if they make that type of signing, and trust Rashod Bateman. Now, should they do that? We saw in 2022 that the Ravens went very young. They did not bring in an established veteran until a couple of weeks before the season, I think, or it might not have been that late. I try to block that out. But Sammy Watkins was their guy, and that was it. You know, they trusted Rashod Bateman in a full-on wide receiver 1 role. Devin Duvernay was supposed to be their wide receiver 2, and it crashed and burned. It was a disaster. Part of that was, I think, the Ravens, one, Eric DeCosta, he's done a lot of great as the Ravens general manager. That, to me, was a mistake by him to go that young. I get believing in your guys, but there's a certain level to that, in my opinion. I think he kind of crossed that level. But they thrust Bateman into that role without a ton of time to get acclimated, especially with that being his second season in the league. I mean, he didn't really have an offseason his rookie year. He was injured for the majority of training camp, didn't come back to week 6, never really got in a rhythm with Lamar Jackson that season. It's different this time around. If you're talking about him coming in as a wide receiver 2, hopefully he can stay healthy. I'm fine with them trusting him in that role, but I would want somebody behind him who I know I could trust if it didn't work or if Bateman got injured again, because the Ravens, they do need wide receiver depth. I think right now, look, they haven't signed anybody, but right now I don't trust just having the 4 guys they have with Flowers, Bateman, Aguilar, and Tylan Wallace. You need another solid veteran option. So if that is Josh Reynolds, I think he is more equipped to step up into a wide receiver 2 role if Bateman either doesn't cut it or he gets injured. But we know the potential with Rashod Bateman. What the Ravens need to see from him and what we need to see from him is just the connection between him and Lamar Jackson. We've seen clips. We've seen film. If you haven't seen it, it is there on social media. But Rashod Bateman does get open. But he and Lamar Jackson just do not have a great connection right now, where they've either been sapped of getting time together due to injuries or they're just not on the same page. It's not quite Miles Boykin level. That was a whole different story. But it's getting to a point where this offseason is the make or break offseason for those two in terms of a connection. This year for Rashod Bateman, I think, is make or break for what his career is going to be in a Ravens uniform. Now, we see the Ravens in what they're trying to do at wide receiver with Lamar, even though he's on his big contract and it kind of alters the way you look at your roster. If they really wanted to bring in a wide receiver, they could probably make it work. They have restructures that they can still do. They've only done one, and that's Ronnie Stanley. But I do think that I think it's okay to show trust in Rashod Bateman here. Players sometimes need that. I just think it didn't work in 2022 because it was such a shift. And it was such a, the Ravens just thrust him in there and threw him in there. That was a lot, right? And circumstances happen and it didn't work. But I think this time it can be different with Zay taking a lot of pressure. There was no one to take pressure off of Rashod Bateman in that wide receiver room. Obviously, we know Mark Andrews is the beast, but I'm talking wide receiver-wise. There was no one in that room in 2022 that could take pressure off of Rashod Bateman. I think it can be different this time around, but it has to be different this time around. This is it for Rashod Bateman here. If he gets that role, if he gets the pure wide receiver 2 role, and I get it's a run-first offense, the stats aren't going to be as gaudy as a Kansas City or one of these high-powered throw-first offenses, but it can't be another season where it's like 2 receptions for 22 yards, 3 receptions for 28 yards, and that's kind of the stat line. There has to be more production if Rashod Bateman gets that role. So personally, I'm okay with it, but I also, if I'm the Ravens, I need to bring somebody else in that can step up. And I know it's not a lot of guys. I mean, personally, I'd rather have a Tyler Boyd, or I don't know why they don't work it out with Odell. I mean, I get it's not, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I know he didn't live up to his $15 million contract, or I guess 18 if you want to go up to 18. But on a lesser deal, I thought he fit well and still a solid player. But we'll see what happens. But Baltimore, to me at least, with bringing in Gallup, bringing in Reynolds, bringing in that type of receiver, is showing trust in Bateman. We'll see how it all plays out. Maybe someone completely different comes in, they make a trade for somebody, then we'll have a different conversation. But for now, I think them bringing in that type of receiver does bode well for Rashod Bateman and a potential clear number 2 role in this offense in 2024. Coming up, though, we'll talk a bit more about both Josh Reynolds and Michael Gallup, what they bring to the table, what to like, what not to like. So stay tuned. Plenty to talk about on this bonus episode of Locked On Ravens. First, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. How's your social battery right now? Is it drained? Is it bursting with energy? Why are you at that level? Or there maybe not enough boundaries? Are you less social in the winter? I know personally for me, I definitely am less social in the winter. I'm a warm weather person through and through. So sometimes I just don't feel as active when it's super cold out. It can be easy to ignore our social battery and spread ourselves thin, especially with social gatherings picking up after the winter. What's the right amount of socializing for you, and how do you recharge? Maybe you thrive around people, or maybe you need some more alone time. Therapy can give you self-awareness to build a social life that doesn't drain your battery. Therapy has so many different benefits, from learning positive coping skills to how to set boundaries. Also, it can empower you to become the best version of yourself. It isn't just for those who've experienced major trauma. It's for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. We're back, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking on this Saturday with you. A bonus episode of Locked On Ravens. Appreciate you tuning in, making some time for me in the show on the weekend. We do these shows, sometimes we do have bonus episodes. So if you want to turn those notifications on, both in audio form and video form, to figure out when we get our content out. Of course, it's Monday through Friday regularly at 6 a.m. That's not changing, but sometimes we do go live after big news. In fact, all the time we go live after big news and after Ravens games during the season. And we do these bonus episodes as well at points during the weekend. So be sure to turn those notifications on and subscribe. Also, if you're on YouTube, like the video. And if you're in audio form, be sure to follow along there. Let's talk about the wide receivers a little bit more, though. We've touched on them over the course of the last couple of days here on this show, first with Michael Gallup and then with Josh Reynolds. So brief background on both guys. Gallup is 28 years old, and actually on the Google search, if you look him up, at least for me, Brandon Cooks is the picture they used for him. But regardless, 266 catches, 3,744 yards, and 21 touchdowns for Gallup over the course of his 6-year career. And for Josh Reynolds, we can go along those lines as well. Came in the league 1 year before Michael Gallup, and he has 220 catches, 2,933 yards, and 19 touchdowns. Now, Reynolds has been more of a big play receiver when he has been on the field. The skewed numbers for him is when he wasn't utilized a lot. Those numbers went down, but over the course of his career, 13.3 career average, but averaged 15.2 last season. For Gallup, he's averaged 14.1 in his career, but that number has gone down since his ACL injury, only 12.3 last year. So with Reynolds and Gallup, I think both of them could be solid options, but if I had to pick one, I think it would be Josh Reynolds. Reynolds works really well over the middle of the field, first down magnet, and has made some tough catches. Now, did have a pretty brutal NFC Championship game where he dropped 2 huge passes. So, of course, that doesn't look great on the resume, but I just think he's a little bit more what the Ravens need. Now, both guys, they're the type of receiver in terms of the bigger body, the jump ball radius, and them going up for those catches. But the thing that concerns me with Michael Gallup a little bit is the injury. It has to be. Tore his ACL week 17 of 2021, literally second day of January in 2022. Missed some time in the 2022 season, came back. Now, he played in all 17 games in 2023. But again, I think that injury has sapped some of the explosiveness, sapped some of the route running, the juice that he had earlier in his career. I'm not saying he can't come to Baltimore and have a year where he kind of proves everybody wrong and looks more like that early Michael Gallup. But Reynolds has been pretty durable over the course of his career, and I just think there is less of an injury risk there. Now, Gallup, I think, is the bigger name. Like, if you would ask who more NFL fans knew based off of the name, I think Michael Gallup probably wins that one. But I think Josh Reynolds is a player that at this point in his career just maybe fits the Ravens a little better and is more, I don't want to say on their timeline, because, I mean, Gallup's 28 and Reynolds is 29. It's not like there's a huge age difference there. But I'm not saying either one is a needle mover. I'm not going to go that far. I think that if you're looking at a needle mover who is still in free agency right now, Tyler Boyd is, like the perfect 2-3 option for a team. Odell Beckham, I'm not saying, he's a pure needle mover at this point in his career, but I don't know. I personally would rather have Odell over those two guys. I don't know why it didn't really work for them to at least talk about it. I mean, maybe Baltimore, again, just wants to get a little younger. Odell's 31, so that is an age factor. But I don't think Josh Reynolds or Gallup would be a bad addition. I just think it kind of fits back into that cycle, and where fans are a little frustrated with it is, well, okay, you're just signing one of these like not so needle moving wide receivers again. Now it's not to the level of like the Jeremy Maclins and the Michael Crabtrees and the Des Bryants and the Sammy Watkins. We can go on and on and on and on with that because those guys were older at that point, but it's not Cortland Sutton. It's not Calvin Ridley or Marquise Brown or those guys that you could slot into a pure number 2 role. It's more so like, how much of an upgrade is Josh Reynolds from an Odell? How much of an upgrade is a Michael Gallup from an Odell? Some people might argue it's a downgrade. And that is what I think a lot of people, when they look at these potential signings, that's what kind of gets them up in arms. Is for all these years, this fan base has been asking for, all right, go out there, get Lamar his A.J. Brown, get Lamar his Stephon Diggs or his DeAndre Hopkins, one of those types of players. Now, Zay Flowers is a heck of a player, right? That's a guy that can turn into a number 1 receiver. But I've seen this before, and I'm not sure I agree with it. But a lot of people are saying, oh, well, Zay doesn't have the stature to be a number 1 wide receiver in the NFL. He's not built like A.J. Brown or built like Stephon Diggs. I don't believe stature determines that personally. I think A.J. Brown, Stephon Diggs, all those guys are awesome. DeAndre Hopkins. It's just a different type of number 1 receiver, right? I don't think you have to be like 6'2", 6'1", and 220 pounds to be a number 1 wide receiver, be built like a DK or an A.J. Brown. You can still be Zay's size and have the skills to be a number 1 wide receiver, but I think you still need a skill set and a talented skill set of, all right, who's the jump ball receiver? Who's a guy that has that big-bodied frame? And while Gallup and Reynolds has that, again, I think a lot of people just want to see the best receiving core placed around Lamar Jackson as possible, and Josh Reynolds and Michael Gallup, again, for a lot of people, haven't fallen that cycle of, all right, here's the veteran edition that is going to get like 300 yards and do this. But I will say, look, everybody thought that with Nelson Aguilar last year. Came in, and while he didn't have 1,000 yards, he stepped up in big moments, made big catches, and the signing went a lot better. And a lot of people were very, very happy when he was re-signed. Now, I think if Aguilar wasn't in the picture, a lot of people would have been more okay with a Josh Reynolds or Michael Gallup. I've seen where, again, how different are Michael Gallup and Nelson Aguilar in terms of skill set and how good they are as a receiver. What's the difference between a Josh Reynolds and a Nelson Aguilar in terms of the type of player they are? Type of player, they are different. They have different skill sets, but in terms of how good they are and where you rank them in the wide receiver rankings, people are saying there's no difference. There's no difference. There's no difference. So I think it might have been a little bit different if Aguilar wasn't in the picture and they signed to Josh Reynolds and everyone was like, okay, cool, but what's the other move? But this is going to be it, I think, for a veteran if they do sign one of those guys. And then it's going to be Bateman number 2. So again, how confident would you feel, right? How confident would you feel if it was Zay Flowers, Rashod Bateman, Josh Reynolds, Nelson Aguilar, Tylan Wallace, and a draft pick? Or how confident would you feel if it's Zay Flowers, Rashod Bateman, Nelson Aguilar, Michael Gallup, Tylan Wallace, and a draft pick? Now, it depends who the draft pick is. If they draft an Adonai Mitchell or Brian Thomas or one of those guys, Xavier Legette, one of the top 2-round wide receiver, I think we're having a different conversation. But if they address this before the draft, I don't think they're going to spend a high draft pick on a receiver. Things are possible. Things change and things can happen. But it's going to be interesting to see how they approach the room because, again, Josh Reynolds and Michael Gallup are not bad football players, but I am not going to dub them needle movers. I think they are complementary pieces to what they believe in Rashod Bateman with and obviously what they believe in Zay with, which is fine. But I think if I were to choose between the two, if we are just strictly talking Michael Gallup versus Josh Reynolds, I'm personally taking Josh Reynolds. Coming up in the final part of the show, though, we'll talk more about the direction of the Ravens right now, go a little bit over their free agency and where they can stand to improve and where they already have improved. Stay tuned, a lot to get to on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. I have UConn personally. My bracket, it's not great. It is busted. I had BYU in my Sweet 16. I had I had a bunch of upsets that I was really confident in. I had Samford beating Kansas. That didn't work out. So my bracket is busted, but I'm still in it. UConn is in it. That means I'm in it. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet college hoops until they cut down the nets. We're back. Our final segment of Locked On Ravens, Saturday style. Kevin Oestreicher talking with you here. Weekend edition, bonus episode. We are usually a Monday through Friday podcast, 6 a.m. Eastern time every single weekday. But we do have these bonus episodes every once in a while. And of course, when there's big news coming out and headlines to talk about, I'd rather dedicate an extra show on the weekend, a bonus episode, as opposed to trying to slam everything into a 30-minute show and not give the proper context to the bigger headlines I want to talk about. So that's where these bonus episodes come in. Really appreciate everybody tuning in today and making us your first listen. As always, be sure to subscribe, video form and audio form, for 5 days a week plus more of Ravens content. If you're a listener in audio form, I appreciate you tuning in. We started off in audio form almost 5 years ago, which is crazy to think about, 2019. And we've been doing this, started up YouTube a couple years later in 2021. We've been going strong ever since on YouTube as well. So if you like both listening and watching, the same show, so you're not missing out on anything. You can watch one day, listen another day. You're not missing out on any content there. Let's talk about the direction of the Ravens a little bit, because I think a lot of people are a little nervous, a little worried about all the losses they've had. But I think some people also are just like, the losses aren't that big of a deal. I think it's a little of both. I think obviously the talent they've lost, we can't sugarcoat that. They have lost a lot of talent. It's going to impact them in a couple of different ways in 2024. But I also think they can recover from losing that talent. They have had contingency plans in place. Example A of that would be Trenton Simpson for Patrick Queen. I think they kind of understood the writing was on the wall with that. Didn't pick up the fifth-year option. Queen goes to the Steelers, which is a whole nother bag of worms. But then you have the Ravens drafting Simpson and him coming in as the replacement. Now, I think I'm going to put this up today on social media, but I'm curious just which loss people think is going to hurt the Ravens the most next year. Because every team does it. Every team loses players and it hurts them. It's not just the Ravens. It's an every team thing in the league. I think if I had to pick top 4, I think Patrick Queen and Geno Stone would be in there. And then I'd probably put Ronald Darby and Kevin Zeitler in that conversation. I think a lot of people are on the train of like, oh, Patrick Queen, he's not going to matter. Geno Stone, not going to matter. It is going to matter, but I think they can recover from that. I think they can recover from both of those guys. Leaving for division rivals, which is another crazy thing. That's a whole other conversation. So many conversations within the conversations. But I'm going to go on a limb. I'm going to go a little bold. I'm going to say Ronald Darby is going to be the guy that hurts them the most. I think he was really solid for him. They can bring in a guy like Stephon Gilmore. They can bring in a guy like Trey White. You can have that. But Darby gave them really quality snaps coming off a torn ACL. Wasn't really expected to do a lot. Remember, it was expected to be Rocky Yassin who was going to step up and be the number 2 corner. And then Brandon Stevens stepped up. And then Ronald Darby stepped up. Rocky Yassin didn't play very well. and the rest was history. Kevin Zeitler also, I think, is a big loss for him. I just think they want to get younger and more athletic on the line. I don't think it had anything to do with how he played in 2023. Definitely struggled in week 1, but was really solid the rest of the season. So, again, nothing to do with Zeitler's play. I just think they really wanted to get younger and more athletic. I personally would have kept Zeitler for probably one more year, especially because he wanted to come back, and it would have eliminated that dead cap hit. So you're getting a quality player and saving about $4 million. But Ravens decided to go elsewhere. The big question mark is, because of that, the offensive line, where they've lost 3 starters. We're going to see if Ben Cleveland, Andrew Voorhees, Daniel Falele, newly signed Josh Jones, Passion McCary, Saleh, all those guys are going to be in the equation, plus a first-round tackle. Or, at the very least, a second-round tackle, I'd assume. I'd assume the Ravens don't let day 2 pass without taking an offensive lineman. I'd be shocked if they let 2 rounds pass without taking an offensive lineman. There are avenues where they can take a wide receiver or a corner or an edge in the first round, but I think offensive line is by far and away this team's top priority and is by far and away this team's top need. And it's just a good draft to need an offensive lineman. Plus, as I've said, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me make this argument a ton. But the way that offensive line and their market in free agency is and through trades, it's best to get them if you're a team through the draft. It's a quality player that's probably better than most free agents out there. If you're drafting a good one, you get them for 4 or 5 years of team control on a cheaper deal. And to me, I think that's how you do it. That's how you, if you're in need of an offensive lineman like that, especially like the Ravens are in a deep class, that's how you should attack this whole situation. So Baltimore is still going to probably make a couple moves in free agency. They could make a surprise trade. I still think they have 1 to 2 medium moves left in them, plus a bunch of other moves around the margins. Like, again, they've gotten corner depth. They've gotten offensive line depth. They bring back Chris Board, those types of moves. They're going to be a lot of those types of moves. But I also think that they could still make a splash or 2 here, big name or 2 here. I don't think it's over. Jadeveon Clowney, Kyle Van Noy, both still free agents. I would assume one of those 2 comes back. I don't know who it's going to be. And again, nothing set in stone, but I think it's important at the edge position to get a veteran in there. And those veteran edge players are drying up as free agency does go on. But now we've hit the lull period almost of free agency where things are still going on. Moves are still being made. We just saw the Jarius Sneed traded to the Titans late last night as we kind of recorded this, not so far after that move happened. Chiefs, by the way, I think got fleeced on that deal. Sneed signed, I think, a $19 million per year extension, and Chiefs only got back a 3rd-round pick next year and a 7th-round pick swap this year. I think the Chiefs got hosed on that deal, but we'll see what happens. Sneed does not have great knees, great medicals, so we'll see if it pays off for either side. But there are still moves going on. I think Baltimore can be a part of that. They can make a move or 2, and I think they should make a move or 2, right? This roster, they added Derrick Henry. That's awesome, but it's not a stretch to say that at this point in time, the roster compared to the last season is worse because they just haven't added. They've lost so many guys and they haven't replaced them. I mean, I'm not saying the roster by the end of the offseason is going to be worse, but right now they've lost 10, 11 guys. They've only signed Derrick Henry and Chris Board from the outside. They've made some key re-signings. I'm not saying they've had a terrible offseason, but the fact is the roster with everybody they have lost is worse than what it was in 2023. So they're going to need to replace some guys, and I would hope they make a couple of big moves because we are in Lamar Jackson's prime, or we're really, really close to it, if not in it. I think we are starting to be in it now. But for the Ravens, they understand what time it is. They understand they got to build contenders for the next couple of seasons, and that does not just mean standing pat and making moves around the margins. You got to go out there, got to make a move or 2. Doesn't have to be tomorrow. Doesn't have to be the next day. Doesn't have to be this month even. Doesn't have to be in March. But the Ravens should at least be in the market, be in the hunt for a couple of big moves down the stretch, even if it does take a couple months. Maybe before the draft is where I'd set that deadline, just because then you're trading 2025 picks and it might not be as valuable for teams who are interested in contending and might not understand. But the draft picks this year are still valuable, so I think you can get more value if you trade your picks this year as opposed to waiting till after the draft and trading next year. That's all I have for you today on Locked On Ravens, though. Thank you so much for tuning into this bonus episode. Be sure to subscribe both in video form and audio form. Follow along for daily Ravens content. Stay tuned. We have a lot coming up here. If there's a move that happens, of course, we'll go live either the day or tomorrow. But if not, I'll see you right back here on Monday on Locked On Ravens.